cover me well. I would like to thank the Loft for creating the Mentor Series program to support the dreams of novice writers like me. And I would also like to thank Jared for his untiring work this past year on behalf of all the mentees. This program would not be the same without you, Jared. And lastly, I would like to thank my family and friends and those in my writing group for coming out to show their support. So I am going to be reading to you from, it's an excerpt from my novel that I have in progress. It's a coming-of-age story set actually in the 1850s about a 14-year-old African-American girl named Liddy Palmer. Her mother has just died, and she has never known her father, and her dream is to go to the university. Really, it's an impossible dream, especially at that time, but she takes in whatever learning she can, and she sneaks in education while working as a maid in a Minnesota lumber baron's household. So Mr. Graham is the teacher who will eventually secretly tutor her, and Manny Scott is the boy that Mr. Graham was actually hired to teach. Manny is 7 years old, he's blind, but neglected by his family. He's spoiled too. In the South, there's slavery. In the North, there's the fight for abolition. There's the fugitive slave law and the North's own brand of bigotry. But the story mainly focuses on these three very different people who will begin to grow in trust and respect for one another. Now, I won't be reading from the first chapter, but from a scene somewhere in the middle of a story. Manny's cries reached us in the kitchen. "What's he going on about now?" Cook grumbled, and slapped the bread dough to the table. I dried my hands and went out to the front hall. Manny had been pestering me all day, excited about leaving with his daddy that evening to join the rest of his family in St. Paul. Sarah had seen to it that his bag was packed. Still, he had dragged me upstairs several times to make sure that this or that had been included in his satchel, because Sarah would not be bothered with his whims after the initial packing. But now, Manny was running out the front door, stumbling down the steps, following the sound that the carriage wheels made on the gravel. "Manny," I called after him. "Father, you said I could go," he was yelling, paying me no mind. Wait for me." He lifted his knees and clenched his fists as he ran, slightly pigeon-toed, heels lifting out the backs of his shoes, stockings sliding down his thin scarecrow legs to puddle at his ankles. There was a lull in the sound of the wind and of the bird calls, as though wind and birds held their breath, watching the boy run and listening to the chuff of his footsteps on the gravel. He tripped and skidded on his belly. I don't know when I had started running after him. I just know that I was. And when he fell, I stopped, breathing hard. Up the drive, the carriage slowed. Mr. Scott didn't make the effort to look back, but the driver did. Mr. Scott reached his arm out the window and tapped at the side of the carriage with his umbrella. The driver's shoulders sagged before he turned around and flicked the horses with the reins. The carriage rattled on down the road. "Lord, boy," I breathed. I walked down the drive to where Manny was lying. He had rolled to his back now, his nose running, his face all scrunched up, his gray eyes staring blankly at the sky. When I got to him, I bent over and touched him. "Come on," I said softly. "I'll walk you back." He cried out and recoiled from me like he was snake bit. He began to kick and flail. I didn't fault him this time. I sat down on the gravel near him, drew up my knees to my chin, watching him until he tired himself out. Dust stuck to his lips and cheeks, all the parts where his eyes and nose had run over. When he quieted, I tugged on him a little. "Come on, Manny," I said. "Come on." He sat up, open-mouthed, sucking at the air with dry spasms. Father lied to me," he said. A high, plaintive puppy dog wail started from deep inside him. "He lied," he said again, and leaned his forehead into my neck. That old, icy daddy hate started growing again down in my belly, expanding as it surged, like hands pushing outward against the inner walls of my throat, so that I was afraid that I would not be able to stop it from breaking the surface this time. I closed my eyes and swallowed hard and put my hand to my throat to push it back down. I waited like this until my breath came evenly. "Ah, Manny," I whispered finally. "I'm tired and full up." I put my arm around him and helped him rise. We walked back to the house together. Manny brushed past Mr. Graham, who stood silently watching in the doorway. Sarah waited on the stairs, ready to take him up to his room. I turned to go back to the kitchen when Mr. Graham stopped me. "It seems," he said quietly, "that the boy is particularly devoted to you." I stopped. "Yes, sir," I said. "Seems so." I would advise against encouraging such an alliance. It may cause more harm than good. It felt like he had just grabbed me by the shoulders and shook me hard. He smiled faintly. You do not agree with me," he said. I shrugged at him. "Ain't my place to agree with you or not agree with you, sir. Ain't my place to say nothing nohow. Ain't my place to carry him for his daddy either." I started to say, "But you can," but I bit it back. "You would ask me to coddle him because his papa will not play with him," he said, like he had read my thoughts. "That is not my job." Then I sighed, feeling too spent to argue further. "I won't say nothing more, sir." I left the hall. That night, I dreamed I chased after my father down a long gravel road, his back turned to me, his hands freckled like mine. Now, the scene that I will read to you now is a small part of a much larger scene. It is what I like to call Liddy's One Perfect Day. Because Manny's family has gone to town, I need to get some water. Manny's family has gone to town, and there's no one to hinder her for taking her lessons. So she's allowed to spend the afternoon in the woods with her teacher, Mr. Graham, and Manny. They have spent the day at lessons, reading and fishing, and Swan is the old servant who has set up the camp. "I think you got a bite there," Swan said. "Have I?" Manny shouted. Mr. Graham narrowly rescued his violin and bow as Manny leaped up, feeling for his fishing pole. "That makes a dozen," Swan said. He pulled the creel from the water, then walked over to get the crates and utensils from the wagon to prepare to clean the catch. He stacked the crates to make the makeshift table. "I'll ready more wood for the fire," Mr. Graham said, and rose from his place on the dock. Swan chuckled softly. "No, sir," he said. "You are assuming that I have no experience at this," Mr. Graham said. "No, sir, made no such assumption. However, I do know you ain't exactly dressed for such a chore. And if you was to damage your violinist's hands, I would never live it down." "Nonsense, Swan. You whistle a tune and I shall keep time with the axe. What do you think I did to keep warm in Philadelphia? With respect and all, you stayed under your newspapers and sheet music." Mr. Graham laughed, already slipping out of his coat. "Just you watch to see how it's done." I nudged Manny with my elbow, and we both laughed kind of quiet. I had never seen Mr. Graham jest in any way. He was always stiffly starched as his collars. Swan talked Mr. Graham out of swinging the axe, however, offering him the knife and the task of cleaning the fish instead. I left Manny and crept closer to where Mr. Graham had set to work on the catch, staying back behind the trees so as not to make him think that I would interfere, or that I could see that he was no longer neat, no longer perfect, with his sleeves rolled up and his dark gypsy hair falling over his spectacles and into his face. Yet something felt wrong, not the hair or the jocularity of the moment, something. It nagged at me, growing more insistent, like a face that pressed to be recognized, or a word that sat on the tip of the tongue but can't be recalled. Then I saw it. I stopped chewing the juniper gum, slowly pushed it with my tongue from one side of my mouth to the other. The something was his beautiful statue of David hands, yet not exactly his hands, above his hands, his wrists. Raised, stretched pink scars twisted around the olive skin of Mr. Graham's wrists like thick, ragged bracelets. I clasped my hands behind my back, pressed my cheek against the rough bark of a red oak, and fell into a trance watching the scars. They scraped away the gray, iridescent scales with a rough, snagging, ripping sound. They worked upward toward the gill, scales flecking his skin and modeling the scars. They coiled around the fish, its eyes staring away at nothing, its mouth moving mutely, open, closed, open, closed. They flipped the fish over and scraped away at the other side. They adjusted the blade in his hand and pressed the sharp point into the white, fleshy underbelly and slit the fish open to its throat. They slipped the entrails, wet, reddish black and shining, out onto the makeshift table. Then the scars, pink and serpentine, wrapped around a cloth and froze. The wind gusted, blowing the dust of crumbling leaves into my eyes. I blinked, breaking the spell. Dreamily, I pulled my gaze from those scars, pulled myself upright in time to catch him watching me study those scars. I tried to smile as though I hadn't noticed. It didn't work right. The silence between us was filled up by the frog's incessant croaking. Mr. Graham turned away and rolled his sleeves back down, securing them at the cuffs. He shoved his arms back into his coat, walked over and crouched at the edge of the stream, swishing his hands in the current to rinse them clean. Swan cleared his throat and, not looking at Mr. Graham, directed Manny and me to search for the old cabin he had mentioned at lunch. "How will we know when you want us back?" I asked. "I will play my music when it's time for you to return," Mr. Graham said over his shoulder. "Come when you hear the music." I took Manny by the hand and we left the camp, heading south until the path faded into underbrush. Trees waved blurred green shadows over us. The strong scent of pine and earth and decay seeped into my pores like ether, and I wondered if perhaps I had dreamed those scars. I was sleepwalking now, directionless. We wandered until we came to the edge of the woods, where a meadow opened up before us. I guided Manny back into the woods. The crunch of leaves and snapping twigs underfoot, and Manny's jabberings sounded somewhere far away, muted by the cacophony, Mr. Graham's word, of my own thoughts. But Manny was excited. The legend of Sleepy Hollow had dazzled him. He chattered, like the squirrels high in the trees above us, about the headless horseman. He wondered if I thought one of those snake-in-the-grass Sioux in that battle that took place around here could have swiped off the head of an Ojibwe brave, and did I think that now that headless brave wandered about these woods trying to find his head, or maybe someone else's. At the same time Manny was jabbering on, in my daydream I was thinking, who is Mr. Graham? Who is he? Those scars were old, not new. Had he tried to kill himself? Why would he do that with a wealthy daddy to take care of him? Maybe his daddy was like Manny's. But the scars went all the way around. It just don't make no kind of sense, I said aloud to myself as I helped Manny over a fallen tree. "Are you even listening to me?" Manny demanded. I mumbled. "Just don't come bothering me when you can't sleep tonight because you've worked yourself into a lather over some headless brave." "I won't." "All right then." I pulled back a young tree branch and led Manny past before I let it go, as I knew I had to let Mr. Graham and his scars go, as Mr. Graham had let the rest of the world go without disturbing it, keeping his own story to himself. I stopped, and Manny stopped too. Quiet as a spirit, a fox glided between the trees and slipped into the brush. "I found it, Manny," I said. "I found the cabin." Thank you.